Your soulmate hired a psychic to check if you were happy. The answer destroyed them. There is something about this message that you may not understand at first. It is not really about the psychic. It is not even about the question your soulmate asked. The real story begins with something much deeper. They wanted to know whether you were happy without them. And that question says more than they ever admitted. At some point, your soulmate became curious about your life. Maybe they had stopped hearing from you. Maybe they could no longer tell what was happening behind your silence. Perhaps they were looking at your pictures, noticing your absence, hearing small updates about you, or simply wondering whether you had finally moved on. They could have asked a friend. They could have contacted you directly. They could have sent a simple message saying, "How are you?" But they didn't. Instead, they chose another route. They hired a psychic. Not necessarily because they completely believed every prediction. They did it because they were desperate for an answer they were too afraid to ask you themselves. The question was simple. Is this person happy? But what they heard afterward was something they were not emotionally prepared to face. Because the answer didn't give them the comfort they wanted. It forced them to confront the possibility that the person they once believed would always remain emotionally connected to them might actually be finding peace. And that realization shook them. Think about what happens when someone assumes you are still waiting for them. They can delay. They can remain silent. They can pretend they don't care. They can tell themselves that whenever they decide to return, you'll still be there. But the moment they begin to suspect that you have genuinely healed, their entire perspective can change. Suddenly, your silence doesn't look like weakness. It looks like distance. Your absence doesn't look temporary. It looks permanent. And your happiness becomes something they cannot control. That is where this story begins. Your soulmate had been carrying a question for longer than you realize. Did they move on? At first, they tried to ignore it. They told themselves that you probably still thought about them. They imagined you checking your phone. They imagined you remembering old conversations. They assumed that somewhere inside you, there was still a door open for them. But something changed. Maybe you stopped reacting. Maybe you stopped explaining yourself. Maybe you stopped posting things that indirectly reflected your emotions. Maybe you simply became quieter. And sometimes silence can be louder than any confession. Your soulmate began noticing that they couldn't read you anymore. They didn't know what you were thinking. They didn't know who you were talking to. They didn't know whether you were still emotionally attached. That uncertainty became uncomfortable. So they searched for answers somewhere else. The psychic listened to the question. Your soulmate expected reassurance. Perhaps they expected to hear something like, "Yes, they still miss you." Maybe they wanted to hear that you were secretly unhappy. Maybe they hoped you were struggling to move forward. Maybe they even wanted confirmation that you still belonged emotionally to the past. But instead, the answer went in a completely different direction. The psychic described someone who had been through emotional exhaustion. Someone who had spent too much time wondering why things happened the way they did. Someone who had experienced disappointment but had slowly learned not to let disappointment define their future. And then came the part your soulmate couldn't handle. The psychic suggested that your happiness was no longer dependent on them. That you were beginning to feel lighter. That you were becoming emotionally independent. That the person who once waited for answers was now learning to create their own peace. Your soulmate went silent. Because deep down, they had never prepared themselves for that possibility. They had prepared for anger. They had prepared for sadness. They had prepared for you to miss them. They had even prepared for you to hate them. But happiness? Real happiness without them? That was different. That hurt. Not because happiness is bad, but because it forced them to recognize what their absence had actually done. They suddenly understood that while they were busy wondering whether you still wanted them, you were potentially learning how to live without needing them. And that realization can destroy an illusion. The illusion that someone will always remain available. The illusion that love automatically means waiting. The illusion that time keeps people frozen in the same emotional position. Your soulmate may have believed that they still had time. Time to return. Time to explain. Time to apologize. Time to say what they should have said earlier. But the psychic's answer introduced a frightening possibility. What if your life had already started moving forward? What if the chapter they thought was paused had actually continued? What if you had become someone they no longer recognized? That thought stayed with them. After the conversation ended, they probably couldn't simply forget it. They may have replayed every interaction with you. Every message. Every moment of distance. Every time you tried to communicate and they didn't respond properly. Every opportunity they ignored. Every emotional signal they misunderstood. And suddenly, things that once seemed insignificant began looking important. They remembered your patience. They remembered your efforts. They remembered moments when you were there even when they didn't deserve your attention. And perhaps most painfully, they remembered how easily they assumed you would always be there. That is one of the hardest lessons people learn. Sometimes you don't recognize someone's value when they are present because their presence feels permanent. Then one day, the silence becomes permanent. And suddenly, everything feels different. Your soulmate may have started comparing the person you were before with the person you appear to be now. Before, you may have wanted answers. Now, you may want peace. Before, you may have tried to fix misunderstandings. Now, you may refuse to chase explanations. Before, their attention may have controlled your emotions. Now, their silence may barely disturb your day. That transformation is powerful. And if they truly care about you, seeing that transformation can create a complicated mixture of emotions. Regret. Fear. Longing. Confusion. Guilt. And something they may not want to admit. Jealousy. Not necessarily jealousy of another person. Sometimes people become jealous of the peace someone develops after they stop receiving their attention. Your soulmate may not be jealous because someone else has you. They may be jealous because life itself seems to be giving you something they once believed they were responsible for providing. You are learning to smile again. You are learning to enjoy ordinary moments. You are building your confidence. You are becoming more selective with your energy. And perhaps the biggest change is that you no longer need someone to validate your worth. That can be incredibly difficult for someone who once felt certain about their place in your life. The psychic's answer may have exposed something your soulmate had been hiding even from themselves. They didn't just want to know whether you were happy. They wanted to know whether you were happy without them. Those are two very different questions. The first is curiosity. The second is emotional attachment. And the fact that they needed to ask may reveal how uncertain they had become. Maybe they had been pretending they were fine. Maybe they had been acting as though they didn't care. Maybe they told other people that you were just part of the past. But when nobody was watching, the question remained. How are they really doing? And now they had an answer that frightened them. You were not necessarily broken. You were not necessarily waiting. You were not necessarily stuck. You were healing. And healing changes people. It changes what they tolerate. It changes what they expect. It changes what they consider love. Most importantly, healing teaches you that missing someone doesn't mean you have to return to them. You can love someone and still choose yourself. You can remember someone without reopening the door. You can forgive without forgetting what happened. You can care without chasing. And that may be exactly what your soulmate is struggling to understand. You can care without chasing. And that may be exactly what your soulmate is struggling to understand. They may have imagined that if they ever came back, you would immediately return to the same emotional position. But you aren't the same person anymore. Time has taught you things. Distance has taught you things. Silence has taught you things. And perhaps the biggest lesson has been this. You cannot build your happiness around someone else's decisions. That is why the psychic's answer felt so devastating. It wasn't simply saying that you were happy. It was suggesting that your happiness had become independent. Your soulmate could no longer assume they were the center of your emotional world. And that realization can create panic. Because suddenly, the power shifts. When someone believes you need them, they feel safe delaying their decision. When they realize you can live without them, they understand that every delay has a consequence. Every missed opportunity matters. Every unsent message becomes more significant. Every maybe later becomes a possible too late. Your soulmate may now be asking themselves questions they avoided for a long time. Did I wait too long? Did I push them away? Did I underestimate their strength? Are they really moving on? Could someone else recognize their value before I do? And perhaps the most painful question. What if they become completely happy without me? That question may have followed them long after the psychic conversation ended. They may have looked at your old conversations. They may have searched your social media. They may have quietly asked mutual connections about you. They may have tried to find evidence that you still cared. But the more they looked, the less certainty they found. And uncertainty is painful when someone is emotionally attached. You might not even know that this is happening. You may simply be living your life. That is the interesting part. You don't have to do anything dramatic. You don't need to make someone jealous. You don't need to post mysterious messages. You don't need to prove that you're happy. Real healing doesn't need an audience. Sometimes the strongest transformation happens quietly. You wake up one morning and realize that something that once consumed your thoughts no longer controls your mood. You remember the person, but the memory doesn't destroy your day. You hear their name, and your heart doesn't collapse. You think about what happened, but instead of asking, "Why wasn't I enough?" you begin asking, "Why did I ever believe I had to earn someone's love?" That is growth. And if your soulmate is observing you from a distance, they may be noticing exactly that. They may see someone who is becoming harder to manipulate emotionally. Someone who understands boundaries. Someone who no longer accepts inconsistent behavior simply because feelings are involved. Someone who has learned that love without respect becomes exhausting. The psychic's answer may have been the first time your soulmate heard this reality reflected back to them. And it hurt because some part of them already knew it. Maybe they had sensed the change before the psychic confirmed it. Maybe they noticed your energy was different. Maybe they felt the distance. Maybe they realized that you weren't reaching out anymore. The psychic didn't create the fear. The psychic simply gave a name to something your soulmate had already been feeling. You were changing. And they were afraid they would be left behind. But here is where the story becomes even more interesting. Your soulmate may not simply be afraid of losing you. They may be afraid of meeting the version of you that exists now. Because the old version of you might have accepted explanations that the new version will question. The old version might have tolerated uncertainty. The new version might demand clarity. The old version might have waited. The new version might choose peace. The old version might have asked, "What can I do to make this work?" The new version might ask, "Is this actually healthy for me?" That is a completely different mindset. And your soulmate may realize that if they return, they cannot return with the same behavior. They cannot expect the same access. They cannot assume your heart is still waiting in the exact same place. They would have to show up differently. They would have to communicate differently. They would have to take responsibility. They would have to become honest. And honesty can be terrifying when someone has spent a long time avoiding difficult emotions. Maybe that's why they haven't contacted you yet. Not because they don't care, but because they don't know what to say. How do you approach someone after realizing they may have healed from the pain you contributed to? How do you admit that you were wrong? How do you explain the silence? How do you tell someone that you were thinking about them even while pretending you weren't? There may be no perfect opening line. So they hesitate. They type something. They delete it. They open the conversation. They close it. They consider calling. They decide against it. Then another day passes. And the fear grows. Because the longer they wait, the more intimidating the first step becomes. Meanwhile, your life continues. You may be focused on your goals. Your work. Your family. Your friendships. Your personal growth. Your future. And that is exactly what may have surprised them. They expected your story to revolve around them. Instead, you started writing new chapters. Not necessarily because you stopped caring, but because you finally understood that your life cannot remain paused while someone else decides what they want. That realization is not revenge. It is maturity. And perhaps your soulmate is now learning that lesson too. The answer from the psychic may have destroyed their old belief that you would always wait. But it may also have destroyed another illusion. The illusion that they could keep their feelings hidden forever. Because once they realized you were becoming happy, their own feelings became impossible to ignore. Suddenly, memories became stronger. Places reminded them of you. Songs reminded them of you. Random moments brought you into their mind. They may have wondered what you were doing at that exact moment. Whether you were smiling. Whether you were thinking about them. Whether someone else was making you happy. And then the question returns. Did I lose them? That question is different from, do they love me? Because love can survive distance. But opportunity doesn't always survive distance. There is a difference between someone loving you and someone being able to have a healthy relationship with you. Your soulmate may finally be realizing that feelings alone were never enough. Timing matters. Communication matters. Consistency matters. Courage matters. If they truly want another chance, they cannot simply depend on emotion. They have to act. And perhaps that's the real reason this psychic reading affected them so deeply. It forced them to understand that your happiness is no longer something they can postpone. You are not a waiting room. You are not an option. You are not a backup plan. You are a person with a life that keeps moving. And if they want a place in that life, they must earn it through honesty and consistency. Not promises. Not mysterious signals. Not jealousy. Not games. Real effort. Real communication. Real accountability. Your soulmate may be thinking about all of this right now. And maybe they are wondering whether the door is still open. The truth is, only you can decide that. A psychic cannot decide your future. A prediction cannot determine your relationship. And neither can this message. Your choices matter. Your boundaries matter. Your real-life circumstances matter. But emotionally, there is something worth recognizing. If someone genuinely cares about you, your happiness should not destroy them. It should ultimately make them happy. If their pain comes from realizing they treated you badly, that pain can become accountability. If their sadness comes from missing you, that feeling can become honest communication. If their fear comes from losing you, it can become motivation to finally stop taking you for granted. So perhaps the psychic's answer wasn't truly the end. Perhaps it was a wake-up call. Maybe your soulmate needed to hear that you were becoming okay because they needed to understand that their opportunity was not guaranteed. They may now realize that love cannot survive forever on potential. At some point, someone has to make a choice. Someone has to speak. Someone has to stop hiding behind fear. And if they choose to approach you, let their actions speak louder than the emotions they suddenly express. Don't be impressed simply because someone misses you. Look at whether they understand why you walked away. Don't be moved merely because they regret losing you. Look at whether they are willing to change what caused the distance. Don't accept words simply because they arrive after silence. Look for consistency. Because your healing has taught you something valuable. You don't need to abandon yourself to keep someone else. And perhaps that is the part your soulmate finally understands. They didn't lose you because you stopped loving. They may have almost lost you because they assumed your love would excuse everything. Those are not the same thing. Your happiness may have become the mirror they needed. It showed them what they could lose. It showed them what they underestimated. It showed them the consequences of waiting too long. And maybe, just maybe, it showed them something about themselves. They still care. They still wonder. They still remember. They still have emotions they haven't fully processed. But now they have a decision to make. They can continue watching from a distance. Or they can become brave enough to communicate. They can remain trapped in regret. Or they can learn from it. They can romanticize the past. Or they can build something healthier in the present. And you? You don't have to stop your life while they decide. Keep becoming stronger. Keep protecting your peace. Keep building the life you want. Keep choosing people who choose you clearly. Because whether your soulmate returns or not, your happiness cannot depend on their timing. That is the real message hidden inside this story. The psychic's answer didn't destroy your soulmate because you were happy. It destroyed the version of reality they had been comfortable believing. They thought you might always be waiting. They discovered you were learning to live. They thought your silence meant you were stuck. They discovered it might mean you were healing. They thought your distance meant you still wanted them to chase. They discovered you might simply have stopped chasing altogether. And now, the person who once wondered whether you could live without them may be forced to ask whether they can accept a life in which you truly do. That is a powerful realization. So if this message resonates with you, don't rush to contact anyone simply because you feel emotionally triggered. You don't need to prove anything. You don't need to force a reunion. You don't need to manufacture signs. Let reality reveal itself through actions. If they truly want to come back, they will eventually have to communicate. If they truly regret what happened, they will have to take responsibility. If they truly value you, they will have to show consistency. And if they do none of those things, your happiness still remains yours. Because perhaps the greatest transformation here is not that your soulmate discovered you may be happy. It is that you discovered you are capable of being happy without waiting for someone else to give you permission. And that is something nobody can take away from you. Not distance. Not silence. Not rejection. Not the past. Not even the uncertainty of what happens next. You have already survived the version of yourself that thought happiness required an answer from them. Now you are becoming the version of yourself that understands happiness can begin with choosing yourself. And somewhere, perhaps, your soulmate is finally realizing that. Maybe that is why the psychic's answer hits so hard. Because for the first time, they weren't hearing about the person they used to know. They were hearing about the person you are becoming. And that person may no longer be willing to accept half-love, mixed signals, delayed decisions, or emotional uncertainty. The answer they received may have hurt. But sometimes a painful truth is the beginning of a necessary awakening. And if they are meant to return to your life, let them return with clarity. Let them return with honesty. Let them return with effort. Let them return as someone ready to meet the person you have become. Because you are not responsible for shrinking your happiness so another person can feel less guilty about losing you. You are allowed to heal. You are allowed to smile. You are allowed to move forward. You are allowed to become happy again. And if your soulmate is watching from a distance, perhaps the most shocking thing they have learned is not that you are happy. It is that you finally realized you deserve to be. And once someone discovers that truth, they become very difficult to pull back into the same old cycle. So don't chase the answer. Don't chase the person. Don't chase the past. Let your life speak for you. Because sometimes the most powerful message you can send to someone who underestimated your strength is not a message at all. It is your peace. It is your growth. It is your ability to wake up each morning and keep going. And if your soulmate truly cares, they will eventually understand what the psychic's answer revealed. You were never meant to spend your entire life waiting for someone to decide your worth. You were meant to live. You were meant to grow. You were meant to experience happiness. And perhaps the person who once feared that you would be lost without them is now discovering something completely unexpected. You were not lost. You were finding yourself. And that realization may be the one thing they never saw coming.